So last week we started our story, the book of Ruth, the story of a couple, mother and child. Now I got to confess, I get confused in this story because my wife is Naomi and her mother is called Ruth, which is the opposite way around. So if I call one Ruth and Naomi, it's because I can't get my head around one being older and younger. So I apologize if I get them mixed up. But in the story, Naomi and her husband Elimelech leave their homeland. They go to Moab, another country, and there things do not go well. Their children die, their two sons die, they're left with their daughters-in-law. Elimelech dies, and Naomi's left on her own and decides that she's going to head back. She hears that there is food back in her homeland, and so she makes the decision to turn back. And that's what we looked at last week, this decision to turn back, to go back to where there's food. One of her daughters leaves her, but Ruth, I did it. Ruth goes with her, and joins her, and that's where we left it. It ends on this cliffhanger. There is harvest time in the house of bread, and so they're heading back. We're going to see where they get next. We're just going to read the story again because it is a story, and then we'll reflect on it afterwards. Chapter 2 starts like this. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Random fact, I wonder if he'll come into play later on. We'll have to see. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. They're running out of food. They're struggling for food, so she thinks, I'll go out and I'll glean. I'll take it from the sides of the field. This was a practice in Israel. They would leave the sides of their field for those who are poor or anyone who'd come to their land, that they could collect food for themselves. Do the farmers still do that? Do you leave the edges of your field? We just lose a few potatoes when you go around the corner a bit quick. It's the same sort of thing. Go to the poor areas and drive quickly around the corners, and then everyone can collect up the potatoes. Anyway, that's what she's doing. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came to the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women and work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The story continues, the plot thickens, more characters are introduced. except for one. I mentioned it last week. There is one character in particular missing from the whole book of Ruth, one that you might expect to be in there. He is referenced slightly, and people do talk about him, but you don't ever see him actually saying anything or doing anything or acting or influencing the story in any way. And that character is God. In the whole book of Ruth, God isn't an active player. He isn't said that he does anything or moves anything. All you have are a few clues. And as you read through the story, you find that there's this hint at the start, this man called Boaz. It doesn't tell us anything about him, just a hint. Keep your eye on this guy because there's something about him. And then they come up with this plan. I'm going to go to the fields and glean and see if I can get some food so that we can be fed. That's her goal. I'm going to go find someone who'll be nice to me, who will show me favor, and see what happens. And there's this one little line that I think sums up this chapter and in fact, most of the book of Ruth. It says that as she goes, in verse, I don't know what verse it is, find it in my Bible, because I haven't got my notes. It's in the second chapter, I know that much. It says she went out, in verse 3. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. And that's as close as we get to God being involved in this story. It just so happened that she ended up in the field of Boaz. And that theme kind of runs through all of this. If you stand back and look at it, it is harvest time. That was the clue at the end of the last chapter. There is hope on the horizon. Something's about to take place, so pay attention. She goes out to find food, and it just so happens, would you believe it, wink, wink, she ended up in the field of this man, Boaz. And it just so happens that the field of Boaz is the kind of field that you want to be in, because it's a safe one where you can gather food. And it just so happens that Boaz turns up that very day that you're there to check on his workers and make sure they're okay. And it just so happens that as he turns up, he notices Ruth working there among his workers and asks a question about her. And it just so happens the person he asked has already found out about her and can tell him. And it just so happens that Boaz is also the kind of guy that you want to notice you because he's a man of integrity and honor. And it just so happens that he takes pity on her and finds favor and is kind to her. And then it just so happens that this man is not just a nice person, but actually he is what's called a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer. Someone who can give them more than hope, but we'll come to that in a bit. The whole book of Ruth is this idea that it just so happens often happens. And when it does happen, it's a clue that there might be something or someone helping it along, helping it to just so happen. That there is a God who might just be in control. Now, there are all kinds of arguments and discussions about God being in control and what does he do and what do we do and do we have free will and choice and does God control all things and work all things out? After years of study and dissertations and lectures and conversations with professors, my conclusion is that everyone is wrong. There you go. Because the Bible does both. And each team on this comes up with their own pile of verses and says, well, it must be this and it must be this. And I think the Bible is beyond us. God is beyond us. And while we want to have it either this way or this way, the Bible says, don't kid yourself, you aren't God. But somehow our choices matter and God is in control. And there is a humility that says, I don't know, but I am responsible and God is in charge. And that's the testimony, I believe. And that's the testimony of Ruth. They make decisions and they make choices, but it just so happens that God works out his plans through them. We talk about God being sovereign, and I often think that it's God kind of tweaking dials and meticulously controlling things. But the Bible's idea of sovereign is a king who leads his nation to glory, or a shepherd who leads his sheep to fields that are good. He doesn't meticulously enforce each sheep to eat what they have to eat, but he leads them to those places that are good, where they can find what they need. And that's the best kind of description I've got. And apart from that, I'll discuss and I'll debate, and I'm happy to have a conversation about it. But it's just this wonderful, mysterious thing that there is a God who's in charge, and yet we are still responsible for our choices. And the book of Ruth is a wonderful example of that. He never mentions his involvement, but there he is, working and moving and guiding. It just so happened. And you may have your just so happens. What I've come to realize is that we are often, like Ruth, like Naomi, like Boaz, we are often very unaware of 1/1,000,000th of the things that God is doing, where it just so happened that we were in this place and we came to that location and we found these people. So my just so happened, I'm here. How did I end up here? Well, there's different ways to tell the story, but one of them is that I was part of a church in Bournemouth, and things weren't going well there. We took a step back and sort of a couple of years to reflect on what church is and what we were giving our lives to, Naomi and I, and through a lecturer. It just so happened that my lecturer in coffee said, well, I know a church. He just so happened to know you guys, and he just so happened to hear that you didn't have a pastor, and so he sent me up here, and things unraveled. Or I'm here. Depending what way you look at it. But the question is, well, then how did I get there? Well, what was I doing in studying with Ian Coffey? Well, it just so happened that I'd come to faith. I'd tried to unconvert my then wife's family and convince them, she wasn't my wife then, my girlfriend's family, unconvert them, and I'd failed in that attempt, and through that come to faith. Well, why was I doing that? Well, it just so happened that I'd met a girl called Naomi, and I liked her, and I'd seen her family, and I'd seen the way they live out their faith, and that interested me. But what was I doing with her? Well, it just so happened that Naomi had a brother called Dan, and he liked doing up cars, so I had a 1-litre Vauxhall Corsa that we put a big exhaust on and removed the air filter and made sound noise, and we'd drive around Bournemouth and cause trouble. But what was I doing with Dan? Well, it just so happened that Dan had a friend called Chris who lived 5 doors up that I'd got to know and was good friends with and enjoyed being around. He was very much like me, and we got on really well. Well, how did I get to know Chris? Well, it just so happened that Chris and I were sat next to each other in psychology at A-level. He was at a part of a different school, but he moved to our school and got to know him through that. What was I doing in psychology with Chris? Well, actually, I wasn't meant to be on that psychology course. I was meant to be doing something else. I think it was geography, which wasn't one of my choices, but psychology was full, so I had to do geography, and I didn't want to. So I went to Mr. Granger, my form tutor, and I said, is there any possibility that I could do psychology, because I'd really like to do that rather than geography? And he pulled a few strings. He seemed to like me, so he spoke to the teacher and got me a space, and so I got to go on psychology. Well, how did he get to that position of teaching me? Well, Mr. Granger used to walk with a limp. And he had a walking stick, and he seemed like quite a young guy, so we'd ask him, what's with the walking stick? Why are you walking with a limp? And his story was that I think he'd been serving in the army, and I think it was the Falklands War he'd served in and got injured, and so had to retrain, became a teacher, and came to our school and was teaching there. So I am here because of the Falklands War. Okay? And that's how I ended up. And at any point of that, something could have been different, something could have changed, so something could have happened, but it just so happened that this and this and this, which leads me to where I am today, and I was unaware of any of those things. I wasn't aware of a millionth of a glimpse of what was going on and what has been worked out and what took place. And I'm also not aware of all the things that I avoided. I have 2 brothers, some of you know, who are in or out of prison, who have made some awful choices and have left behind a series of broken relationships and abandoned children. And because they're my brothers, I'm very aware that it's very easy to look and go, that could be me. Save for some awful choices and some right people at the right time and some direction and guidance, that's what I've avoided. And I'm not aware of any of the things that I avoided because I avoided them. I don't know what they are or what they would be. But it just so happened that I was put in the right place and given the grace to respond in different ways that I am where I am. Paul puts it like this. He says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. Sorry, no, he doesn't say that. That's what we often think. God works all things together, so God will work everything out. What it actually says is that God in all things. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. That's slightly different. Not all things are good, not all things are right. Bad things do happen, things do go wrong. It's only a chapter ago that Naomi was moaning about how God had abandoned her, that God had left her, that God had turned his face against them. But in all things, in whatever's going on, God works for the good of those who love him. In all things, God is working things out, and he is sowing and he is guiding so that it just so happens that there is hope even when it seems hopeless, that there is a direction even when you feel lost, that there is light even when everything feels dark, because in all things, our God is at work. Not everything happens for a reason. I know we like to say that. Some things happen because the world is dark and evil. But even there, God is at work in those things to bring good out of it. And if we look, there are fingerprints where it just so happened. Where it just so happened, or it's kind of the Bible winking at us. He might be just there. He might be around the corner. He might be up to something. It's just you aren't aware of it. And often we don't. Like I say, Naomi missed it. The Almighty has made my life bitter, she says. The Lord has turned his hand against me. And then the next chapter she's going, Lord, bless that man Boaz because he has been good to me. Suddenly she sees it. Oh, I didn't see he was at work when we were in a foreign country and my sons had died. I couldn't see it. God had turned against me. But now I see in all things he has been working and he has brought us to this place. He does it because he loves us, that verse says. We love him, he's loved us, and this working things out is an evidence. It's a measure. It's a proof of God's love. But we struggle with that because the question, well, for me at least, comes, well, when things aren't working out, does that mean that God doesn't love me? Next week I've got my graduation coming up, and as part of that I had to hire the silly hat and the gown, and so you had to fill in my information. So I went on just to see how much it would be, measured myself up, put it in, worked out the price, and that was fine. I thought I'll come back to that later. Came back to it later, still in my basket, ready to go. Thought, but I will just check, make sure I measure it out properly. Measured myself, my head had grown 5 inches. And my chest had grown 10 inches. Now, I've been doing a bit of exercise, thank you for noticing. But it made me go, well, what's going on? I'm just going to show you a picture, see if you can figure out what the problem is. Tape measure stretched. Using the wrong measure to figure out how big something is. I think we do the same with God's love. I think we try and measure God's love using the wrong tape measure. And often the thing that we try and measure is how things are going. So in chapter 2 of Ruth, we go, well, God must love her because look, she's guided her, she's brought her to this field, she's provided Boaz, therefore God must love her. Look how good he's been. But in chapter 1, where they've lost Naomi's lost her children and they're on the verge of starvation, well then we're kind of question it. Well, maybe God doesn't love her. And then we go, well, which is it? Which tape measure am I going to use? Is it, does he love her? Does he not love her? Is he loving her over there, but now he's not loving her? What's going on? How do I measure it? While God working things out is a sign of his love, the opposite isn't true. When things are going wrong, it isn't a sign of his displeasure. We know this because Paul goes on after that verse and says this, who will bring any charges against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Here's what we do. We hear God loves us, okay, that's fine. But then something inside us tells us, I'm not sure if that's true. Because I start to feel really bad. I make poor choices. I get things wrong. And inside, there is something that goes, no, he can't love you because why would you be feeling like this? He can't love you because why would you have this guilt? He can't love you because how could you do the things that you've just done and still claim that God would love you? And Paul goes on in Romans and says, there is nothing inside of you that could ever separate you from God's love. There is nothing going on in your heart that would ever separate you from God's love. There is no charge, there is no voice, there is no other thing that you can hear or take on or think or feel that will mean God isn't loving you. The inside's covered. And then he goes on and says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? So trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword. I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. The inside's covered. There's nothing you can feel that would separate you, and the outside is covered. No matter what goes on, famine, nakedness, whatever it is, that is not how you measure God's love. And Paul's he's stretching language to its very limit to try and tell you what is going on in your life is not a measure of God's love. What is happening to you, nothing will separate you from his love. Nothing that happens or goes on will ever be an indicator that God doesn't love you. That isn't how you measure. If you're measuring it with that, you're using the wrong tape measure. You're always going to get the wrong result. It doesn't change. There is one tape measure that we're to use for God's love, and it's the fact that he sent his son to give his life for us. And nothing you ever feel inside will change that fact, and nothing that ever goes on outside, as horrific as it might be, will ever change that fact. That is the only tape measure. That is the only guarantee. That is the only thing that we're asked to use. Everything else is a dodgy measure. If you think God doesn't love you because this wouldn't happen and it couldn't possibly be going this wrong and it couldn't possibly be this bad, that's not how you measure it. There are other things at work. There is an enemy at work. There is a broken world. There are choices we make. They are not how we measure God's love. God's love is only measured by the fact that he came and gave his life for us in Jesus. And everything else is mystery and trying to work out. But Paul says that what's happening in those situations is God is working good because he loves you. You can be rock solid. That's the only thing you can be. I'm convinced. And that word is with absolute certainty, as sure as I can be, nothing can separate you from his love. And so while Ruth 2, God at work, we go, oh, wow, isn't God good? Doesn't he love us? Yes, he does. But he also did in chapter 1, where everything was going wrong. And they couldn't see where God was at work, and they weren't aware of his hand or his fingerprints. The love was still the same there. That isn't how we measure it. We are convinced. If we do, then we're always going to come up with a dodgy result. Do you remember Lazarus? Lazarus gets raised from the dead. What a sign of God's love. But then he died again. I wonder if the second time he's going, well, where were you that time, Jesus? Neither was a measure of his love. It was a sign of God's power. It was a sign of his kingdom. But it's not a measure of his love. The only proof, the only thing that can save us when the inside goes wrong and when the outside goes wrong is that we stop measuring it by those things. And instead, we measure it by what God has done. That unchangeable fact that history testifies to, that will never be any different tomorrow than it is today. No matter what you think inside, whatever conclusion you draw outside, his love remains. We measure with the wrong thing. And I also think we measure the wrong thing. In all things, God works together. And that doesn't mean that everything works out. That means in the long run, over time, not in the moment by moment, but over your life, you are working towards something that is good. You see, in this chapter 2, Ruth and Naomi hatch this plan. We need to go out and get some food. They're looking for a bit of relief. We just need a meal. We just need some food on the table. We just need a bit of safety. And she goes out and she comes back with a lot, an ephah. I thought, what's an ephah? So I typed it in online. It said an ephah is 1/10 of a homer, or a little over a bushel. So there you go. It's actually about 2 stone, I think. She returns with enough flour to feed them for weeks. It's about 10 times more than she would have expected. And Boaz promises that she can keep working with them till the end of the season. But then what? They've got a temporary respite. They've got a bit of relief until the end of the season. But what happens when the season ends? When winter comes and the food goes, they are exactly as they were before. God isn't at work just to give us some temporary relief. What we find is that this man Boaz is more than just someone who gives relief. He is their family redeemer, which is a cultural practice of that time, where if a man died and left his wife and children and land, then another member of the family would marry them, would take them on and take up their land and protect them and provide for them for the rest of their lives. See, we want relief, but God is working to give us redemption. And that's something slightly different. Something very different. Naomi, I think, knows that they need more than relief. And so when she hears this name Boaz, there's an excitement. This isn't just a man who's going to provide us with a bit of food for a few months. This is someone who can rescue us for the rest of our lives. This isn't someone who's just going to feed us for a moment. This is someone that if we come into his family, we will be safe forever. And I think often what we're doing when we're looking for God to be at work, we're looking for where's he going to relieve me because things are hard. Where's he going to give me a bit of respite? And I believe he does do that. But when God's working all things to good, he has a greater goal. Yes, there's relief and respite, but his ultimate goal is for us to be redeemed. To find that he will bring us to himself, bind us to him, so that we are secure forever. We are loved forever. We have hope no matter what. We have a hope that passes through death itself, that nothing in this world can take away. And even if we do end up dying, that hope still carries us through. That's redemption. That's something more than simply respite from where we are. You hear that on restaurants, don't you? Things like, come for the food, but stay for the atmosphere. Or a holiday, come for the sun, but stay for the relaxed lifestyle. Maybe church is like that. You come for the relief, but you stay for new life being birthed in you. Come for respite, but find that your life can be centered on the source of life. Come to make your life easier, but stay because there is one who can strengthen you even when life isn't easy. Come to get nice things and nice people and nice coffee and nice chat, but stay because there is one who is enough for you when you have nothing. We're looking for relief, but we find in the story that they get redemption. And so they they look for Boaz. They realize that there is more than just relief here. There is something that they cannot get anywhere else. Someone who can redeem them. And perhaps you in your situation, you're trying to look for God to be at work. You're trying to find out what he's up to. And you're looking for respite. And like I said, I believe he gives that. But he's working for something greater. That even if you never find the relief you want, and never find the help you want, and you never find that burden lifted, or that sickness going, or that trial disappearing, even if that never happens, you get redemption. You get a rock that is so solid that you can plant your feet on it no matter what the season. You get a hope that is so strong that all the powers of hell cannot extinguish it. You get life that is so explosive that no matter how much is taken from you, it still overflows. You get forgiveness. You get to say, God, you're my Father. You get to share in his life. Last week I showed you this gospel outline. Jesus is God with us, come to show us God's love, save us from sin, set up God's kingdom, and shut down religion. But it's that last line that's redemption, so we can share in God's life. All the other stuff is the gifts of the gospel, and they're wonderful, but only because they lead us to redemption. All the other things are relief. The relief that I am loved, the relief that my sin doesn't count against me, the relief that there is a new kingdom, that this isn't going to be the way it is forever. That religion is empty and dead, but there is real life. That's all great, but only because that leads me to redemption, where I share in God's life. And I have all that I need. I am safe forever. I am his forever. I am bound to him. What is true of him is true of me. Just like when you get married, you say, for better, for worse, and all that I have is yours, and all that you have is mine. That's what happens. Except with Jesus, we kind of go, all that I have is yours, and I've got nothing. Or I've got a lot of mess. Or I've got a lot of baggage. I've got a lot of struggle. I've got a lot of fears, but now that's yours. And Jesus says, all I have is yours. Except it isn't baggage and fears, it's love, and it's grace, and it's hope, and it's joy, and it's peace. And it's a kingdom that lasts forever. That's redemption. God doesn't deal with us by sweeping our mess under a big God-sized rug or by fixing the things the way we think he should. God leads us to redemption. So this whole mystery of God who's at work, it is a struggle, but often because we're measuring with the wrong thing. We think that where we are and what's going on is a sign of how God feels about us. It absolutely is not. And it's a struggle because we measure the wrong thing. We're trying to get God to do little things that might make things easier for a moment, and he's trying to work something greater and grander so that we have what we need no matter what circumstance we're in, that we are strong no matter how difficult it is. And so you, whatever your story is, it just so happened that you're here today. And it may be because that's what you needed to hear. Maybe because God wants to assure you of his love. And these two widows facing starvation tell a story that there is a God who is at work. And it just so happened that they found themselves in the right place to get the redemption that they needed. Because that's who we are. We are addicts who are just so happen to find ourselves in the right place to get the freedom that we need. We feel unworthy, like failures, and it just so happens you're in the place where you can find the approval, the only approval that matters. We are the lost and the confused who just so happen to find themselves in the place where there is a foundation that is solid. We are the wandering, we are the ones who feel empty, who just so happen to find ourselves in a place where there is a calling that fits us and fills us. And there are those here who are struggling just to get through the day, thinking they aren't good enough, who've just so happened to come to the place where they can hear they are loved securely, powerfully, forever fully. Because our family Redeemer, whose name is Jesus, has bought us at great cost. And he's paid the price once and for all. So that every doubt, every question, everything that we look around and think, does he, would he, can he, get swept away with the assurance that he does, that he has once and for all. And the measure of that is not how we feel on the inside or what's going on the outside. The proof of that is the good news that he has already. So loved the world that he gave his son. In a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to remember. We're going to come around a table where we remember how much he loved us. We're going to take bread and wine, which is a reminder of the one event, the one thing that we look to say, of course he does. And perhaps today you do it in a different way. Because whatever is at work of you in your life or whatever's going on, here's the moment where you can come and say, he does. The way I've been feeling this week, the things I've said, the things that I found in me, that I sickened myself, I thought that meant that he couldn't possibly love me. But then I look and I realize that doesn't matter. That doesn't count against me. Who can charge against me? Jesus has already paid the price. I was struggling this week. It's been the sickness and the trial and the difficulty and the struggle, and I'm trying to fix it and I'm trying to solve it. God, why aren't you at work? And you come and you look and go, still don't know why. Still not sure what you're up to. But you still love me. It's not an evidence that you've abandoned me. In a few years' time, a few months' time, a few weeks' time, maybe I'll look back and go, it just so happened that I was in the right place at the right time, that God gave me the thing that I needed. I'm just going to ask Richard just to play for a moment, just while you reflect on what that means for you. And then I'll ask the deacons to come up and we'll take communion to remember. We've remembered today already, and Jesus does the same. Just like those people whose crucial role it was to give their lives for the freedom of others. And it's our crucial role to remember. We do that again. It was his crucial role to give his life that we might have freedom. And it's our crucial role to remember that. Just reflect on what that might mean for you today before we take communion together.